with the developers and startups that share your goals.
Learn new skills, meet new peers, and discover the latest in technology.
Events are running around the clock, so join us anytime, anywhere.
Reactors are communities to connect. We want you to meet real developers and entrepreneurs just like you. Here you can get skilled up and learn from our product experts in the Microsoft Cloud and in open source. So watch us on demand and share your own perspective as we live stream in communities all around the world.
Hi, good evening, and welcome back to another episode from samosachai.net series. My name is Rashmita, and I'm the event planner for Microsoft Reactor India. I'm here today joined by our very own host, Vivek, and of course, our special guest speakers, Tulika and Aditya. But before I hand over the floor, I would request you all to read our code of conduct. We are all here to learn together, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, being kind and considerate in the way you engage. The chat section is open throughout, and we do encourage you all to participate. Our speakers will answer all your questions during the session, so please feel free to drop all your questions in the chat section. With this, thank you all. Enjoy your session, and over to you, Vivek. Let me bring Vivek into the stream. Hey,
Hey
Vivek.
Rashmita, good
Awesome.
evening.
Good evening. How are you?
All good, and good evening to all the audience. Hey, audience, let us know from where you are joining us in the chat. Just put it in the chat. Where are you joining from? Yeah, and we have guests today in our samosachai.net show. Let me bring them in. It's Chulika and Aditya. I'm just going to remove this. Yeah. Hey, how are you?
Doing good, Vivek. It's been
All
a couple
good?
of days since I met you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's just
I
like
was waiting to
three
hear
days
what
back.
time period was going to be mentioned in this.
And I know, by the way, who is second time on samosachai.net show? Like, Tulika, you've been on the show before?
Yes, for me, this is like the third time, I think.
Third time, because oh man, I'm getting old. Yeah. So Aditya, yours is second time, right?
Actually, not. So, I mean, if we include the in-person meet, this would probably be my fourth because I
Wow.
joined for the .NET 20-year
.NET 20
anniversary.
years.
We had
Yeah.
the session on functions technician I had where Vivek was cheering from uh, the chat because I believe you were at Open Source India around those days as well. And
Yeah.
then,
I
of
was
course, we
in
had
the
the
conference.
in-person. Yeah. So then we had the in-person meet for the 1 year anniversary, and then we've got today. So fourth time.
Wow. So we have repeaters here. So you know what
Veterans of
Samosa
Samosa
Chai.
Chai.
Yeah, you're legends
Yeah.
basically. So by the way, you know, you know
I-
about
I'll
Samosa
I'll
Chai
keep
dot net.
coming
We
till
have
you
some.
actually give me the samosa and try.
Yeah, I think you need to. So you send me your address after this show. I will dunzo samosa and chai to you or Swiggy, whatever. Yeah. And by the way, people are joining from Bangalore, from Noida. Only two places? Come on,
Both
folks. I
cities
think
I've been
we
from.
are.
So
Yeah.
it's nice because I remember I
Yeah.
used to study in Noida, so I spent a good while there. And that place actually has a really blooming and blossoming community at the moment. So good to see
Yeah.
people joining from there.
Yep. 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 And I think from more cities are coming in. Kanpur and where else? It's good. Kanpur is here too. Where is IPL teams? Like, oh, there are some
Lucknow's
10
there
teams.
now.
Yeah, so people should be there from everywhere now. Okay. Oh, one guy is from Italy. Very good. Thank you for joining in. Cool. So let's get started. Um, we have a bunch of things to cover. Yes, Ghaziabad, Punjab, great. And I'm just sharing my screen. So, welcome to samosachai.net show, Aditya and Tulka. Um, Interesting. If this is for audience, if you want to go back and catch up with our previous episodes, just go back and I'll take a look at this particular link. You can access all of our episodes here. So that's an interesting set of sessions we've been doing there. We have done a microservice session, 8 part series, and that's something which was an interesting one. So go back and check it out. That's one of the thing. And what are we doing today, Aditya and Tulika, is it's basically we will learn cloud computing, and it's going to be tough because uh, sometimes I feel this is a very easy question to answer. What is cloud computing? But then you realize, oh, the person who don't have any knowledge on cloud computing, it's very difficult to explain what is cloud computing is. Right? So that's the that's the crux of it. But anyways, we are going to talk about cloud computing and some of the things which it does provide, and then we're going to see one of the .NET core web apps and how we can deploy it on Azure. So Aditya is going to do the demo for us. Great. So let's get started. So this is the link for this particular learn module, which we are going to discuss, and we're going to spend time on it. This is where you can get access to it. So aka.ms, samosachai.net. That's the link, and the link is also on the chat, so you can also go back and take a look at it. It's basically a 2 hours learning path. So if you sit down and read through everything, and there are hands-on session there as well. If you try and execute it, it's a 2 hour learn path, but we're going to simplify it for you. So yeah, so if you land on that link, so these are the 4 learn modules which is there. So we'll go through each of these learn modules. To start with, we're going to start with describing cloud computing, what cloud computing is and what it is. So I don't want to discuss what is Azure fundamentals. It's basically an exam. If you want to get through and understand and get certified on knowing knowledge about cloud computing, uh, this is what you need to complete. So this is something which you can read through and understand it. So let's get started. So important question to Aditya and Tulika, like cloud computing. What's cloud computing? It's the most difficult question to answer, in fact. And I realized this uh, in in front of an audience in a college. I was talking about containers, and uh, we even went and discussed about orchestration and everything. And I did a demo of containers and everything. And then one of the students stood up and asked, "What is cloud computing?" And what's cloud computing? I thought it's easy to answer this question because it's known to everyone. Like what is cloud computing is, but yeah, like what according to you is cloud computing is. So Tulika, you go first.
So for me, cloud computing is that whenever I am running my applications not on data centers, which is at my location, basically not on the server under my desk, but in somebody else's data center, where I don't have to worry about things like updating my infrastructure, even procurement for that matter. For me, that is cloud computing, that if I'm running it not locally within my IT managed infrastructure, but somewhere else in somebody else's managed infrastructure. That's cloud computing for me. Probably
Yep,
not the
yep.
right definition according to the Microsoft
I told
definition.
you. I told you it's the most difficult question to answer. I don't know what all things to cover there. You can say, yeah, it's basically we are running compute online, storage is online, you're just accessing all the compute and resources through internet. So that's one way of telling, but yeah, that's one of the definitions of it. So Aditya,
It's
wh-
always a
wh-
very interesting question when this comes up. I think the way when I talk about this, I, instead of from the provider's perspective, start by this conversation from the perspective of someone who would like to use it, right? Like, for example, whether it's within the folks here in our comment section, whether it's us, we're developers, right? We're building apps and solutions that other people can use. And especially at this point, um, if you are setting up an application, if you are taking it out there, it needs to run on something, right? Um, it could be a server, it could be a VM, whatever. You need some amount of compute to run it. Now, conventionally in the past, what that would mean is you have a system, you've taken it, you've purchased a system that you've set up specifically as an environment to run this application. Then you're exposing it across the internet, maybe using a tool like Nginx or something of that sort, right? But that's expensive because you have to buy the hardware, you have to buy software to set up that environment at times. You need someone who can maintain it, and upgrade it in the future and so on. It gets quite expensive that way. But what if you did not have to do that? What if you had a service where you could rent hardware, connect to it across the internet, um, set up your software on it? It's You might have to manage it, you might not. That's probably something we'll talk about as we get into cloud computing models and so on. But what if you could just access compute that someone else is providing you over the internet and rent it effectively? That's what cloud computing is to me, right? It's the ability to consume and rent this compute power that someone else is providing across the internet. And like, I think it makes it a little easier to understand, right? Because it's everything that you would be doing with your own infrastructure, just the fact that you don't own the infrastructure. You're just renting it from someone else or borrowing it for that matter.
True.
So
It's basically. Let me summarize it. So it's basically you're having compute, storage, and network over an internet, and nothing on your systems. It's all you're accessing through internet, and basically there are reasons why you're accessing over internet, right? For scalability, for availability, and uh, you know
convenience.
performance, and obviously cost. This is the major thing as well. So yeah, we are going to discuss about the benefits as well. But anyway, so this is what cloud computing is. So that's something. So somebody did answer, Manoj did answer in the chat, say deployment of our code on a remote computer that would run it 24/7, and also accessible to the general public. That's one of the way to put it in. So now you know why it is the most difficult question to answer, because there are different ways to answer this, and there are different set of audience for this question, and that's the way it is so difficult to answer. Okay, perfect. So let's move forward, and we'll go to the next unit in the learn module, which talks about shared responsibility. So this is very interesting, um, because you know uh, if you have everything on prem, so that means everything you are running, you have your own data center, you have your own network hosting, you are managing it in house, then it becomes your responsibility to run your applications. But what if you move everything, or move some parts of it to the to the cloud? How this works? So if you see this diagram, there is where some of the responsibility is on the customer, and some of the responsibility is shared between the customer and the cloud providers. By the way, this is cloud providers are those people who provide these services, the services which we talked about, the compute, network, storage. All these things can be categorized into different things, right? So this is what cloud providers provide. And these are there are a couple of other things. So there is SaaS, there is PaaS, and there's infrastructure as a service, there is platform as a service, and software as a service, right? So We'll talk about all these different services when we get to the next stage of the discussion. But I just wanted to bring out what is shared responsibility is. So a couple of things you will manage, couple of things at to one level, and rest of the things is managed by the service provider. So if you in this diagram, if you see the infrastructure as a service, um, you know until the physical hosting and network and data center is managed by the service provider, and rest of the things is managed by the customer himself. And obviously this gets the responsibility get less when you use platform as a service, when you use software as a service, kind of a thing. We'll come there. But anyways, I just wanted to bring this out and try and understand where the responsibility is and where we can do this. So this is a very interesting thing. So Tulika, you want to go and take a stab at what private cloud is? um,
So, a private cloud is, well, in some ways, it's probably the easiest cloud to understand. It's basically a data center which resides for your company. So, a private cloud is something which is for your organization only. It's used by just one entity or one customer. When I say customer, it's probably an organization and not just one person. So private cloud is, I mean, if you have very stringent requirements, sometimes a lot of organizations have stringent requirements about they cannot have their data anywhere else. They have to have the data on premise with them, like some of the financial institutions, healthcare institutions. So in that case, private cloud is probably, the only way forward for them. The other option is the public cloud, which is at the extreme opposite, which is that you go and ask a cloud provider and they will build, manage, control the entire cloud for you. So they will run their own data centers. They are responsible for standing up the data centers, standing up the machines in the data centers, and anybody can purchase like some of the services from that data center, and it'll be like generally available on the internet. So going back to our definition, cloud is available on the internet. It can generally be available over the internet. But all data now resides at the data center of your cloud provider. That's the major difference, unlike the private cloud. Um, One way that we see a lot of organizations going forward is a hybrid cloud. A hybrid cloud is basically you have a data center at your end. So you have a private cloud at your end, but you also want some of the services to connect to a public cloud. So in that case, most of the cloud providers today provide ways in which you can connect your private cloud through some kind of networking options so that you can connect your private cloud and your public cloud. So you can take advantage of both worlds, if you will. You can keep your data, or at least the sense. Now, generally, in all organizations, not all data is sensitive. Generally, it'll be some part of the data which is sensitive. That you can keep in your private cloud, while you have your public cloud where you can get the more services, the reliability, the scalability what cloud provides, and you can take advantage of that by some kind of network connection between the private and the public cloud. We are seeing
yep.
hybrid clouds in our environments. We are seeing more and more customers opt for the hybrid
Yep.
cloud just because it
Got
gives
it.
you best of both worlds.
True. Uh, Before I go to the next, right? When was your first encounter with cloud? Like, when did you try it out first?
So I've always been in Azure App Service. I mean, right when the team started, so that was about 10 years ago. I was one of the first members of the team. So I think about 10 years ago, I started with cloud and app services.
Wow. So here is Tulika, who is part of products team, and um, you know 10 years into the cloud, and she's working on app service, which is obviously a PaaS, and we're going to discuss that in next. So that's interesting. So the question comes to you now, Aditya, like when was your first time? I know graduated like what, 6 months back.
Yeah, just last year
That's
essentially. But interestingly, it was also Azure back in 2019. That happened through the Microsoft Learn Student Ambassadors program. Actually, that's a program I got involved in just at the beginning of my sophomore year, and that's what exposed me to the cloud world. So I think probably the first thing I tried was setting up an Azure VM, and that was mainly because I think it was the easiest for me to understand because I'd tried playing around with VMs in the past through on Hyper-V actually, for that matter, as well as a couple of other virtualization tools like VirtualBox and so on. So because I'd heard of this thing called a VM, so I think that's probably the first tool that I tried. But I think from there on, there was a whole wide world to explore, right? Going from the PaaS offerings, which I do still actively use. And we'll be talking about that later on, of course. Um, the databases, I'm especially fond of some of the services there. I've been playing around with Cosmos DB a bit. SQL Server is, of course, the one constant. And then cognitive services. So any of our folks here who've been to Reactor Bangalore, I think we've probably had a couple of chats around cognitive services and some of the other offerings. But all across, I think I've had an interesting set of experiences across quite a few offerings that Azure has had, and it's still um, it still catches my interest all the time.
you know, when I started my career, the way we used to work was like we had machines, and we used to go to those machines. As we used to have CDs. We used to put those CDs and used to ghost the machine. And so, you know what is ghosting the
Oh,
machine?
Yep.
It's basically you can save the state of that machine on the CD, and you can bring that
the
machine
equivalent
back
of a
to that
snapshot,
state.
right?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
basically, you're taking it on a CD and you're putting it and you're bringing it back. It is almost like a 1.5 hour or
Wow.
2 hours process of bringing that machine back to the old state, and then installing our latest release or latest patch or whatever build which we have got onto that machine, and then start development and start doing whatever we were working on and testing it and other things. So we were using those specific things. So imagine how it has evolved, right? From that point in time where I used to put CDs into those machines to accessing it over private network, private cloud, because we moved from there to using VMware ESX servers,
Yep.
where it was completely private cloud. And instead of going to office, I can access it from my home if I have VPN. So I can access these machines from my home, which was good. It was private, yes. And then moving on to public cloud, it's all evolving, right? So that's the evolve. So by the way, I'm not old. I'm just saying it's it's just it's just 10 years, right? It's just 10 years or 12 years. Yeah, that's how
Vivek
fast.
started early. Yeah,
Yeah,
he
it
just
started.
graduated along with me only, for
Yeah.
2 months here.
So let's move on. Anyways, we did talk about public cloud, hybrid cloud, and you can just take a look at this. Nowadays people are also talking about multi-cloud architectures. I don't want to confuse people. There are multiple service providers in cloud, and you could make use of multiple cloud service providers to make sure that you are always available, and if something happens on one of the cloud, your other cloud is running, because it's both of them are on different data centers and probably on different places or locations. And there are a bunch of services which Azure provides, like Azure Arc and other services, VMware solutions, where you can use it in terms of managing your multi-cloud environment and other things. So that's something which you can go back and explore. Cloud has always been a consumption model, right? So basically, how it's not like you go back and you pay for it and then purchase it upfront. It is more of paying for most of the things you use, and if you're not using, you're not paying for it. That's been one of the major thing about cost and cloud, right? So that's where you're saving cost. Obviously, if you think about my scenario, right, we had bunch of machines to do the performance testings, to do all those bugs which were coming from the QA team. We need to test these issues. We need to sit with the tester and figure out where the performance issues he was seeing and other things. So there were a bunch of machines which we had. So to manage those machines, to manage all of these things is a cost. Imagine all of those things have moved into the cloud service provider, and you're just accessing all of these things over network, and it has everything available for you from a dashboard to everything. It is showing where the machine issues are happening, where your app issues are happening, and everything is available for you. So that's the interesting part about cloud. So I'll not go about comparing pricing and other things. We have a amazing calculator, so you can go back and take a look at the calculator and figure out is it which of those services are suitable for you from a cost perspective. Those are things which you can figure it out. Coming to the benefits of the uh, cloud, right? So very interesting section I have here is uh, availability. And w- you know sometimes this gets very difficult to answer these questions. If you've written the Azure fundamentals exam, right? These questions are actually very confusing. Sometimes they talk about uh, tell me, is it a elasticity scenario or availability scenario or a reliability scenario? So it gets confusing, right? Even if you've been working in this area for a long time, for 10 years, whatever it is, but suddenly you get those kind of questions like, ah, it should be reliability, right? Or it should be elasticity. So Aditya, when it comes to availability, like, what comes to your mind in from a cloud perspective?
Uptime. That's
Okay.
I mean, in a single word, I would say uptime, because availability means that it's running, it's up there, it doesn't crash.
Yes.
Right? When we look at people talking about 99.99% availability or 0.999, we're talking about how much time it's going to be guaranteed to stay up within the year and so on. And I'm happy they've mentioned and talked about service level agreements. That I think for anyone who starts using cloud, that's something to understand as well along with
Yep.
that. But yeah, that way I think availability to me refers to uptime particularly.
True, true, and yeah, it's obviously that most important thing about having your service running in cloud is it should be available all the time, and
Exactly.
it should definitely be accessible and available, so that your services serving the purpose, there's business transactions are happening. So
Exactly.
that comes to the scalability part of it, because if it has to be available, it has to be scalable, right? So obviously you all don't have to purchase uh, with huge CPUs and RAMs for running application, right? You can start with small, and you can actually grow in cloud. So that's where,
It's
right,
true.
Tulika can answer this, like how scalability acts in terms of scaling an application. And we'll come to PaaS layer, how it helps you to scale as well.
So before we go there, I just want to mention a couple of points about availability also. So availability, in my mind, there are two kinds of availability. One is the cloud provider availability. So if you're using Azure App Service, how available is App Service as a service? So that's one kind of availability. And we do a bunch of things underneath the hood to make sure that we meet the SLA. And that's where the service level agreements come into the picture. There is also the availability of your app. So a cloud service provider can provide you availability, and that will help you, of course. But you as a customer is always, you have to be responsible for the availability of your application as well. And there are several ways, and
Yeah.
maybe Vivek will cover it later, on how do you, make sure that you have things which are pinging your app, making sure that it's available, taking corrective actions if it's not available. So just pinging an app and, deciding, oh, it's not available is not enough. Obviously, you have to take a corrective action. So availability is, and I'm coming from a product perspective, and I've worked on availability for a really, really long time. It is a very nuanced thing for me, because it just, there is right from the VM to be available, which is running your app, to the database, which is, having your transactions, to the app itself. Like there are so many moving parts to availability. So first of all, I just wanted
Very
to.
true. Yeah.
True, true.
um, and the second is scalability. So one of the things that, for at least for cloud, is extremely important, that you have the ability, and it's the differentiator from your private cloud, or from running on machines, is that you can scale like instantly. And there are two kinds of scaling. One is you just add more compute capability into an existing VM, because ultimately everything which runs in the cloud, even in the cloud, is running on a VM. So you just, add more CPU, add more memory to an existing VM. That's one way of scaling. And that's what is written over here is vertical scaling. But I think the real power of cloud is the horizontal scaling, because the horizontal scaling is what lets you do things which are more dynamic in nature. Because, adding more CPU to a single VM is only going to do so much. It would now depend on your application, on how well multi-threaded it is, how it can handle and run on each of the CPUs, and, take advantage of it. The real power of the cloud is the ability to do a horizontal scaling, which means as you get more requests, as you get more CPU usage, as you get more memory usage, or even just based on time of the day, you can just scale out and have more VMs who can now process your requests. And I think that's the real power of cloud, where you can define that. And you can even, most cloud providers will allow you to set rules. Say that, oh, if I get more than 10,000 requests, then go scale me out to X number of VMs, and then scale back in. And, because it is like that, it's so hard often for me when I get on customer calls to answer the question, how much is it going to cost? Well, it's going to cost,
Ah,
it's not a fixed cost. It is going to be based on what you need. But, you can go up as high as you want to. You can run on 200 VMs if you wanted. You can run on one if you wanted. You could even run on the free tier if you wanted to. So, you know,
So,
sorry,
so
that was
there
a
is,
much longer
it's
answer than
actually
you
a
thought.
very interesting challenge,
yeah.
and because it's something I've been spending some more time learning about lately, and I think um, horizontal scaling is especially very interesting if you look at real world cases and scenarios as well. And probably I think one that the audience will relate with, especially, is cricket matches on Hotstar, for example. That was one example that blew up, right? Um, Handling those many viewers together on one single live stream, that was a massive challenge of its own. And it's, the moment you start entering that world of how you distribute load across these systems and so on, I think it's really where this entire cloud native experience starts shining out. Because um, I've looked at on-prem systems as well in the past. I remember back in my high school, we actually had an on-prem server for our internal ERP and so on, right? And I remember there'd be instances where the that would crash essentially. Like for example, post exams when everyone's checking their results online on that. And then, they've all come together and everyone's gone online together at the same time, and it's a really interesting challenge, I will say.
So very interesting question comes up here is when to choose vertical scaling and when to choose horizontal scaling. Tulika, if you know you, I know you have been talking to customers, so uh, is there a rule there, like this is the reason why I'm going to choose vertical scaling, or this is where I'm going to choose horizontal scaling?
So I think vertical scaling is when your demand is predictive in nature. So you know for a fact that your application, first of all, you have to understand that not every application is going to respond well if you throw more CPU at it. Not
Yeah.
every type of problem can be solved by throwing more CPU or even more memory at it. So first of all, you have to understand what kind of application you're running. There are applications which are, well behaved and multi-threaded. If your application is such that it can take advantage if you throw more CPUs at it, and your need for the application is predictive in nature, so you know for a fact that all through the day you're going to get, I don't know, I'm picking a number, 10,000 requests, and it's going to be pretty much constant, pretty much stable, and that's what you need. You've written a well-designed applications which is going to take advantage of all your CPUs and memory. In that case, vertical scaling is the way to go. But most of us, when we write applications, we are not exactly like we would want to do the best thing in the world. I honestly believe as developers, we try to write the best code possible. But we often, miss writing code such that it can take advantage of all the hardware that can be thrown at the code. And if
Yeah,
that's
I mean
if
that's true.
that's kind of application, then and if you don't know, if you haven't done enough testing to know, in that case I would say horizontal scaling is your best bet, because then
True.
you're
I
letting the
mean, as
system manage the traffic and manage everything for you.
it's a very very good insight for the audience who are here. Like, you know, it's basically, if you've not written your code to take advantage of the hardware, the best bet is to go and use horizontal scaling to scale your application. So hands down. So there are some questions which is coming in. Uh, one is, what happens in the back end, sorry, what happens in the back
On the
of the
cloud itself.
cloud when a service is scaled? um, Interesting. So it depends on how you're scaling it, but yeah, interesting question. So, and if you're doing horizontal, obviously you're bringing in a new service, new server, and it is getting added into the load balancer or any of those auto scaling mechanism you're using. And in vertical scaling as well, the more CPUs is getting live migrations also been done as well. But there is you, Tulika, I want to I know you have any more information on how what happens in the backend in cloud when we do vertical scaling?
So vertical scaling typically will have something where we actually wh- so these are VMs which are often allocated on host machines for you. When we allocate the VMs, we will, I'm sorry, there's a lot of background noise in my hand. Sorry about that. There's a train line just next to my house. And every time I'm on a call, there's
The train
something.
goes.
Yeah.
time, time for samosa chai break.
Yeah, so when vertical scaling happens, we generally go back to the host VM and we say, so when we take a VM, we put throttles or limits when we allocate a VM. And when we do vertical scaling, we change the throttle and limit. So we go back to the host and say that we are going to change the throttle and limits and therefore increase the size of the VM. Uh, However, I will warn that when we do that, we often have to, depending on the service, of course, but we often have to restart the VM. So, depending on the kind of service that you have, you might have a cold start problem. That is when, the VM on which you're hosted is going to restart.
Yeah.
So, you probably want to do it, not during your peak times or not during production times.
So I would suggest the person to you know to go and try VirtualBox and on his laptop and try and see how you can throttle your VM and run couple of applications on your VM and see when it is jammed and how when you throttle what happens, when you change the settings what happens and other things, and whether you restarts and you play around with that. It will give you a very good idea about how the virtual machine and virtual machine kind of works, and then uh, apply that in a cloud scenario, how this can be automated and you can use it. So I think that will give you a pretty good idea about how to use this. So anyways, there are um, okay, there are some questions like very interesting one. E-commerce website use which scale? Flipkart.
So
So we'll come to that architecture. Um,
I actually have a comment on that.
yeah,
I
sure.
was
Go ahead,
thinking
Aditya.
about it, and the thing is, so when you talk about an e-commerce platform like that, with the number of moving parts they have,
Yep.
there's so many dependencies. I don't think we can predict that actually, because
Yeah.
it'll depend a lot on how their underlying code is structured, what sort of services they have, which services specifically are going facing load at what times. And so the thing is that when you talk about vertical scaling and horizontal scaling, you have to take it very well case by case, right? Like
Yep.
they will have analytics to understand what services face what kind of load, what code is optimized for what purposes, and based on that, they will make a decision for which kind of scaling they need to go for. So I think it's not possible for us to predict, because obviously there's parts of the infrastructure that we might not know either, right? But for that matter, um, just because a certain way works for one application does not mean you can take the same over to the other place. So it really should be taken on a case by case scenario here, because you probably can't predict whether Flipkart is doing the same thing as Amazon or Myntra or Snapdeal, right? So it really goes on a case by case basis, and for that, like I mean, it'll depend heavily on what specific parts of the infrastructure they see load come to at what points of time.
True.
Actually, I had worked with the Flipkart team when
Oh,
they were onboarding with Azure. And what we found at that time, the biggest bottleneck was network rather than the scale itself, because they had so many different services which were trying to talk to each other and get data from each other. And this is they hadn't completely gone the microservice route, but they all had so many different parts to it that our ultimate solution was, I remember that we should have a dedicated line from Flipkart offices from their own data centers into the Microsoft data centers, just to make sure that, a fiber optic cable going there, just to make sure that that bottleneck was removed. I mean, what I'm trying to say to Aditya's point, that it's very hard to say, depends on how the application is
yeah.
architected.
True.
That
True.
I would say discovering that to be the solution must have been a really interesting period.
Yeah, and people are asking questions. So uh, uh, if just keep asking questions, so we'll take up those questions as and when we discuss about it. So moving forward about reliability, right? This is a very interesting one. Whenever I talk about Azure well architected framework, when I do these sessions, I talk about this, how I mean recovering from failures. Um, and Aditya, you might not know this because this is an enterprise word. Uh, it's called um recovery time objective. So
I've
there is something
come
called as
across. Yeah.
recovery time objective. So I was working with one of the enterprise, and um, I was defining the recovery time objective. So the process there is to bring down your system from a data perspective, from the rest of the apps perspective, and see how much time it takes for you to come back. And basically you tell, okay, this is the time we can recover. So enterprise was happy that we said 35 minutes we'll be back online, after doing those tests. Just after 1 month, we did go down, and that was real scenario. This was a test which we were doing, and we gave them 35 minutes of recovery. But then when it went down, it took more than 2.5 hours. You know why? Because things had changed within that month. Within one and a half months, there were a lot of data got added. There were a lot of services got added into the system. There were new bunch of things which we were doing. So it is very interesting. It's not just about, as you mentioned, to look at, it's about two types. Basically, one, service provider providing you a reliability uh, of the services which they provide, but then you should also have your own set of planning on top of that, how you can recover from failures. And that is the where the multi-cloud architecture and other things which has come into picture. Obviously predictability is always important, from a cost perspective, from a performance perspective. You need to understand the what is the cost it is going to be, and what are the things your app is going to perform, and how it is going to perform, and all those stuff. So anyways, these are a couple of benefits. Obviously we did talk about performance, and we have been discussing about cost. It does save cost. It definitely does save cost from whatever kind of situation I have seen from my career itself. The machines we had, the rooms we had for those machines. Interesting stories behind that, because I used to wear those jackets and go to access those machines. And in summer I was wearing jacket, and my mom was like, what this where do you work actually? Why are you wearing jacket and going to office? And no, I'm going into the labs, where it will be too cold to manage these machines. Anyways, that's part of it. But that does definitely saves cost. Anyways, this has been a very important and been a very important part of cloud, right? So to look at how this is going to play in futuristically as well, and for now as well, how it is playing a role in specifically from security and governance in cloud.
So, most cloud providers will often go for a lot of certifications just to make sure, because we are seeing in this age that there are requirements, legal requirements for companies to make sure that their data is safe harbor practices, make sure that data complies to certain limitations. So, at least for Azure, if you go to the Azure certification site, you'll see the list of certifications that we already have, things like the FedRAMP certification, for the healthcare certifications. So these are basically for governance on how the data is being managed. So this is not just where we are. So we have two kinds of governance. One is where are we storing the data? So that's the, and we have specific data centers, at least again for Azure. We have a data center in China, for example. That's all for data in China. We have one for the US government, or the US Gov Cloud that we have. So we have, data location. That's one part of governance. The second part of it is who can access the data. So you obviously as a customer can access the data, but within Microsoft also, who can access the data, and that's another part of governance which is very important for us. And finally, how long are we retaining the data, which is another major part of it. So you know customers will have confidence on our services only once we follow all these certifications and make sure that we are actually following it. So that's one part of it. And another thing that we recently started working a lot is making sure that we are on the most updated security patches, not just for the VMs itself, but also for every language stack that we have. So if we have PHP on our VM, we have to make sure that it's got the latest security update. If we've got Node.js, so .NET, of course, we are doing the due diligence, but we have to make sure that for every single language that we are having it, I know that within Microsoft we have security incidents, and there's an entire team who only run scans across all our services and flag if the services you have a vulnerability or not updated. And for us, it's if a vulnerability is found on one of our services, one of our VMs, it's a hands on deck, stop doing everything else. That's what you need to go after, which makes sense,
Yeah.
like, because keeping data secure for our customers, keeping the OS secure for our customers is the highest priority.
Yeah, and from Azure perspective as well, whenever you're creating those services, there are policies which you can apply uh, to make sure some of these securities and some of the governing things you can apply on top of your service when you just deploy it. So those are the things, automated ways has also been provided by Azure, but at the back end we do take care of a lot of things. Anyways, let us go back. Let us move fast in terms of, like, yeah, obviously it is about manageable, management of the cloud, and there are two types. So, one is managing the cloud, we did discuss, and also accessing this cloud. Which of those, you like to access cloud from, like web app, web portal, or CLI, or which one do you like, Aditya?
Um, I know the web portal is definitely quite convenient. I have on occasion used the CLI as well. Um, yeah, so those are probably the two most
VS
common
Code
for
as
me
well.
at least. Yeah, VS Code, of course, with the extensions, is
Yeah.
at least some of these I do observe interacts with the shell underneath at times. But yeah, VS Code, of course, is very convenient that way.
If I give you a choice,
Is
which
it
is
the
your
shell or the
favorite?
APIs? Might be switching between there, but yeah.
Which
Um,
is your favorite?
I will say on a lot of instances it's the portal, because what I do is I'll go to the portal, I'll set up my stuff, I'll set up my CI/CD, and then I'll stop worrying about it. That's what I normally end up doing for the PaaS offerings especially. So that's one thing I make sure to do.
So what about you, Tulika? Like, which one do you like?
So actually had to go and use the APIs quite a bit because we had to, create things which is built on top of APIs. So I've got quite familiar with using the APIs, and we use it. We've actually developed some internal tools just to call the API and get it. For us, that works the fastest often because we know which are the parameters. We don't have to find it on the portal and click at different places.
I will say there are times, however, where the CLI is actually very convenient as well.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
outside of Azure as well, because with AppRate we're building out a PaaS, right? So we can deploy it anywhere. But like for services, depending on what service it is, the CLI can really be a great power tool for you.
Yeah.
Um,
True.
I think that way PowerShell itself is thoroughly underrated because it's a
Mm.
fabulous tool for a lot of things.
True.
I know I've run database migrations on Azure SQL Server with my application running, and I've done that for sure, and then do recognize how powerful it can be at times. So those are great tools if for someone who's really learning more about the cloud from a DevOps perspective as well, from a cloud management perspective, the CLI, it's something that I highly recommend folks to get more active with.
So a couple of uh, audience are also answering this question, by the way.
Yeah, nice. It's
so
actually quite
so
nice.
so Pranav says he likes web portal, so he's new to cloud and he would love to learn the other ways, which is good, and try it out. And there are people who love PowerShell, like you mentioned, Aditya. So
Actually, on
uh,
the contrary, they're preferring the GUI over PowerShell.
yeah, so which is good
I
as
will
well. You
say,
can, yeah, and yeah,
I must say here, Azure's actually done a wonderful job with their web portal, because I've tried multiple platforms, and I think a big reason why I remained sticky with Azure in the initial days was because I think the UX of the web portal that Azure has is actually really good. It's simple to use, it's easy to understand, and that's a big kudos to the Azure teams.
Yep. And there is a question on which one is more secure. I think everything, all of them are
All of them,
secure. Yeah,
you're
because
authenticating in
all
every
of
case.
these,
So
yeah, all of these are clients. These are all talking to the resource manager at the end of the day, and there is an authentication which is happening when you talk to resource manager. And once you are authorized, and once you have the role, once you have all of those things, then you get access to create a service or update a service or whatever it is what you want to do with the cloud. So yep, so let's move on to the next set of things, which is very simple. Infrastructure as a service, we did discuss about this. It's basically a VM, and you're accessing a machine or a network, is nothing but infrastructure as a service. um, there are a couple of use cases through it, lift and shift. So uh, when you are moving from on-prem to cloud, it's easy to use VMs because it is the similar infrastructure. All the thing is, it's on the cloud, so you're just moving from the executing in the local to the cloud. So there are a couple of scenarios, and obviously testing and development you want to do, and you don't want to really run something on the PaaS layers. You would just want to install your application, or set up your application on a simple VM. You can go back and do it. So there are a bunch of use cases to it. So here it is, platform as a service, and we have platform as a service expert sitting here. So Tilika, just give us a brief description about platform as a service. How does it work, and how does it actually um, help people build, and difference between infrastructure as a service and PaaS. Which one to choose and when to choose. That will be a good starter.
So, platform as a service is um, something where you just bring your code and we'll take care of the rest. That's basically what we aim to do at the very least. It's basically you as the developer should not be concerned about what kind of OS am I running on, what is the patch I'm running on, when will it be patched again, what is the framework version I'm using. All this is something that you, I want to say outsource, but maybe there's a better term. You give it to the cloud provider, and that's their responsibility. So as a developer, you can basically optimize and just concentrate on your own productivity without worrying about everything else which it takes to run the service. So, in simple terms, that's platform as a service. And we provide PaaS offerings for web apps, which is the team I look at. But then that it's not limited to web apps. You could have PaaS for your databases, for example. So you don't have to worry about what database version you're going to use, which OS the database is running on, what patch it's running on. Everything else will be taken care of. We also, when we do patch, we do regular updates and we publish when we are doing updates to the OS as well as to everything else which is running on it. So basically, as a developer, you now have the freedom to do what you do best, which is write code, and not worry about everything else needed to run that code. And that's what PaaS in simple terms.
I
Yep,
think
yep.
that way, PaaS has actually led to the creation of a couple of other really interesting sub paradigms here, like the containers as a service space and the functions as a service space, which I'm especially fond of. And I believe the baseline has come the
PaaS.
from PaaS itself. So it's definitely very, very interesting.
Actually,
Um,
for Microsoft, we classify like CAS and like
yeah,
CAS and FAS all under the bucket of PaaS. So everything is
effectively.
PaaS, and
Yeah.
basically, then you can run it as a container, or you can run it as a function, or you can run it as a web app, or you can run it as a database.
One interesting thing, once you start using PaaS, you don't want to go back to VMs.
So it was funny when you were telling those stories about the VMs. I've never ever set up an Azure VM ever. Like that's almost like the first thing everybody does on Azure. I I mean, I was talking to some in a hackathon and everybody was trying to set up a VM and they were asking me. I'm like, I have no idea how to do this.
I remember, I think we actually had a very interesting experience back when I was participating in the Imagine Cup, because we did some very interesting stuff on Azure VMs there. Because I think the one benefit that infrastructure as a service definitely does provide, right? Like where PaaS gives you the ability to just let the cloud provider manage it all. I think infrastructure as a service has so much more flexibility at times, especially because I remember when we were when we were working on that project, we had to work with some OS level stuff as well, and we built a Flask API around it that we then exposed using an alternative to Nginx. Actually, we didn't use Nginx; we used something else for Flask, but it does provide a lot of flexibility, and some use cases can really come out of there.
So we have that time chart, not a time
Yeah.
chart, that chart over there between control and productivity. So
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
it really depends on
Yeah,
your kind of application. What,
exactly.
how much control do you need versus
Also,
are you willing to let go of the control and just concentrate on your code? But I
Yeah,
will
yeah,
say
very
that,
true.
opening those ports and setting up the network, why would you want to do it?
I mean, it's been a long time for me as well, setting up a VM. Uh, but once you set up, once you start working on PaaS layers, and it's hard to go back to infrastructure layer and say I'll set up a VM and I'll set up Python, I'll set up everything on that, and then start using it. No, somebody give me PaaS. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
no,
how it
I
is.
can imagine that. But I will say, like for someone who's starting off, it's actually a really good learning practice.
Yeah.
So it's
Yep.
definitely an experience someone should get.
Yep.
To have to set up a virtual network on their own and play around. Oh God, scary days.
I know.
Imagine managing all these things in production with all the routers and subnets and uh,
The
different.
superhumans is what I will say. The people who have to do that on a regular basis.
Oh, I
It
have done
is.
that. I have done that in production. So yeah,
Vivek,
yeah,
we
I'm
already call you a
superhuman.
superhuman. We know that.
Okay, perfect, cool. So Aditya, let's move on and uh, show us how to get started with .NET app and web app, and how we can deploy this into Azure. And so, by the way, we are going to use Azure App Service, right, to deploy this,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
obviously we will know what this Azure App Service provides and other things uh, while we are doing that deployment. So, do you want to share your screen, Aditya? So,
I will just do that. Just before that, one thing I'll do is I'll shift StreamYard here to my right side. I do have a second display here, and I'll just keep it here so that I can use my main working device. Let me bring up my screen in the meantime. All right, so I think my screen is shared.
yeah, I can share your screen.
Mhm.
J-
So, a couple of things that I just mentioned before we jump into this, what we'll be using here. Firstly, of course, is .NET. If someone wants to follow along with for .NET particularly, we've got the lovely .NET website where you can install the SDK from. The second thing you will need here, of course, is Azure. I already have an account. If you don't have one, I do know that Azure does let you get started, have a trial account for free, and I believe Vivek can help with the link once for that as
So,
well in the chat.
Aditya, can you just zoom in a little bit on
Yeah,
both the? Yeah.
yep.
Yeah.
So we've got the .NET website, of course, which is a wonderful short domain, .net. I absolutely love it. It's so convenient. We've got the Azure website as well. Um, that's one thing, and they've got a free Azure trial, which is really handy. The third thing I'm going to be using is VS Code. Now I don't remember the website for that, but the good thing is you can just search it up. It's code.visualstudio.com. So these are the tools I'm going to be using here. All right. And for me at least, I do have it set up already. Um, so I will hop into my terminal here. For context, for someone who's working with .NET, if you have the .NET SDK installed, just a way to check that your .NET SDK is working and running is um, by running a simple command in your terminal, and that is .NET space hyphen hyphen version. And if you can see a number there, that means you have a .NET SDK installed. Now I have .NET 7, which I will be using here. That is the version I recommend people to install at the moment. Once your .NET SDK is installed, I'll actually zoom in a little further so this is clearer. I will be running a little command to create a new web app. And the command here is .NET new web app hyphen O. And let's call it Samosa Chai. I think it's a
Yep.
good name for this one, right? Now,
Yep.
what this command is going to do is within the directory I have this set, and that's actually not the directory I want to be installing it in. So I'm just going to go enter my desktop. Yeah, but what this command here is going to do is it's going to use the scaffolding available with the .NET CLI that comes with the SDK to generate a new web app. And it'll create the hyphen O means it'll go ahead, it'll create a new directory for me. And this application here, it's going to be called Samosa Chai. So the moment I do that within my desktop, it's going to go ahead and create a directory with this ASP.NET Core web app. Now I'm going to go ahead and open this up in my VS Code now. So the moment I do that, I see that we've got this little web app set up already, right? We've got the program file, we've got a few pages, an index page, all of that. And, once we do that, you can go ahead, you can, run it, try it out. Just to give it a little check, what I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do is I'll run a command .NET watch here, which basically runs it and additionally enables hot reload. So any edits I make are also visible. I'm just doing these initial steps to set up this little web app for us, but the moment you run this, you will find this little web app set up. I'm going to make a slight change to it though. What I will do here is, if I go to the index page, I will I'll update the heading we have and it'll just say, welcome to Let's Learn .NET. So once I save this, it will, reload this file and show my changes here, right? Which is quite convenient. Now, of course, we do want to go ahead and deploy this to Azure. So for that, VS Code actually has a lovely little extension available. I already have it installed, but what I recommend is if you don't, you can go ahead to the Azure Extensions Marketplace and they have the Azure App Service extension. You've got the Azure account. I do recommend getting the Azure account, of course, because this will add the extension to let you sign into your Azure account. For me, at least, I have done that already. However, make sure to get the Azure account at least and the Azure App Service extension, since we will be using that for now. It actually has quite the range of offerings here. So you can, in the future, for your use cases and so on, install extensions as need be, because these do help a lot with productivity of your development productivity. Vivek, I think you were going to add something there.
Yeah. So just before we go into that, so Tulika, can you can you just talk about the app service, because you've been working with app service for 10 years now, and how it is helpful for developers to get started, and why app service, and what, in which scenarios I'm going to use this app service. And obviously there has been a lot of questions around when to use app service versus functions. uh, so those are a couple of things, questions come up from communities usually. So would you take a stab at that?
Um, so this is a question I can go on for a long time. So therefore, I'll try to limit my answer. So app service is our PaaS offering, which is oriented towards web. So if you're going to create a web application and you just want to you want to bring your code and run the application, in that case, app service is the best option for you. Internally, we will run the application on a VM. That's how we work. However, we will manage like for any PaaS, we will manage the VM for you. So if you have a web application, I would say app service is your best option. Any kind of customer portal, any kind of front end that you want to create, any e-commerce sites, any product information blog, those are some of the most common scenarios that we see on app service. App service also provides two variations. So you can choose whether you want to install it on Windows or you want to do it on Linux. And we provide both the options for you. So for .NET, and I don't know what Aditya is going to choose right now. He probably hasn't chosen anything, so it's going to be Windows. But if you were, let's say, doing a PHP, Node.js, Python app, then you might prefer to use the Linux options for us. So that's basic app service. Internally, we do a lot of other things. We containerize the website and run it for you. So internally we are actually using containers, and we give you the option to bring your own container as well. So if you have a container and you just want to run it on app service, we let you do that as well. Now, coming to function app, a function app is generally when you want to create something which is event driven. Function is by nature something which works on event driven kind of an architecture. So you have something where you add an entry to a blob storage and you want something to happen. You add an entry to a Cosmos DB and you want something to happen. A typical example might be any kind of order processing. So the order is placed. Once it's processed, maybe you're adding an entry to your blob storage. And as soon as the entry goes, you want to generate the invoice, you want to manage the payment, you want to do some kind of delivery logistics. In that case, functions is your best thing because it works on the basis of triggers. That's the advantage of functions. In real life scenarios, I think app service and functions goes hand in hand. You would typically create some kind of a front end which will go and trigger either based on a timer or based on some kind of an event, a function app. And those are some of the most common customer scenarios that we see, that they have a front end portal and they have, I won't say it's a back end per se, it's more like an event driven component which is associated with the web app. And that's where we should see a lot of function usage um, on our end.
Got it. I think uh, that's the crux of it, right? So basically you go and use functions when you are more into consumption, and you are not really looking at control over the infrastructure. And the other thing is app service, you can control the infrastructure, which OS and all those things. And that's something which is interesting. So I would request audience to go back and try out functions, try out Azure app service, and really see how, in which scenarios you want to use this in a in different places. So go ahead, Aditya, continue with your demo. I just stopped you there.
No worries at all. I think that was actually immensely helpful. Um, so, coming back to the demo, once you have a couple of these tools installed, you will find a new tab here within your VS Code instance, and that's the Azure tab. So, for me, I see that, I've got my resources, and this is mainly because I am already logged into my Azure account here. As you can see, I'm gonna close that for now, but that's a good reminder. This lets me, get some amount of visibility as to what sort of services I have already available and running on my app, on my Azure subscription right now. And additionally, here, this is my local workspace. So this actually lets me deploy my application over. So I think what we can do here is I'm going to go ahead and I'll create an app service instance first out of these resources. And for that, I believe before that, I probably should create a resource group, which refers to a grouping of resources on your um, Azure account. The idea is that it lets you keep similar sort of resources, maybe resources for a common purpose together, and you can get better oversight into billing, set similar um, access management for them, and so on. So I'm going to create a resource group here, and I will call it Samosa Chai. I will click enter. The next thing I'm going to do is setting a location. In my case here, what I will do is I will look for central India, particularly. Yeah. One thing I recommend for folks is that if you have an instance, you want like probably at the first go, it's a good idea to select a location that is closer to you, especially if this isn't a vastly distributed or a scaled instance. Um, because this is a localized scenario here, I want to keep my instance closer to me. That does help decrease latency for one. And of course, I am sure that compliance does factor in as well on a few different fronts. But yes, my recommendation would be that if you're just trying this out for the first time, pick a location closer to you. Central India is the one I'm going to do. And what this will do is it will create a research group here for me. Now I'll go ahead and I'll create my app service web app. What I The first thing I need to do is I need to select a globally unique name. This is going to be a little tricky because at time this is the same name that will be used to create the subdomain for your deployment on Azure as well. So in my case, I'll take something like Samosa Chai Aditya test. Intentionally something a little excessive. Also, when you go to the web portal, it actually runs an additional check to show you whether that domain is already the same name has been used already or not, which is quite handy. The next thing to do is to select the runtime stack. As you can see, there is quite the range of runtime offerings here as well. In my case, because this is a .NET 7 application, I will use .NET 7. But this goes to show what different languages and platforms that you could actually use along with Azure App Service. Um, so quite versatile that way. Next up, of course, is the pricing tier. This does give me three recommendations for pricing tier already. It also has an additional link to understand pricing better. Because this is a test app, I will choose the free tier for sure. But you can go ahead and decide your pricing tiers based on the usage you expect for your application. Like if this is an application you expect to have a high amount of usage, the free tier is probably not the best way to go. But if it's a test application and this is solely for you to test and try out, the free is good enough. For students, particularly if you are just working on your own side project, the free is a good way to go. And then if you want to expand it further, you could do that accordingly. So the moment I select that, I actually think I did not get. I think it selected the location for me itself. That's something to look into for this particular extension. But
We have changed some of our management APIs to do a default location for
ah,
you.
I see. I will say it does lead to a simpler experience, for sure.
Yeah,
And I do
that
believe
was the intent that, as a user, you just give the name and
ah,
we'll do everything else for you. That was the intent.
makes sense. Makes sense.
So Aditya, when you're told you will do this demo, that's the reason why I bought
I see.
product. Like, it's easy to answer.
I'm not okay. I think there's an error here. It can't create this particular web app because my subscription allows a different set of regions. In that case, let me try one thing because I do believe if I deploy from the workspace, it does let me create a separate instance from here as well. If I don't want to use an existing one, and it allows a more granular set of options. So let me just go ahead and try that once. Huh. That, by the way, the error, it's not an error, it needs a configuration available locally to deploy. But once I do that,
So just for the audience, we have a limit on
yeah.
how many free apps you can have per subscription. So Aditya probably has more than,
I
four, I
think
think is the limit. It's three or four. I forget which one. I'll
maybe.
have to look at the documentation. So he probably has
Right.
that many apps, and that's why he's getting running into a
In
limit
that
sometimes.
case, let me do one thing. I'll just create a basic tier application for
Yeah,
now.
that should work.
That should be good.
Yeah, free tier.
I'll just go with the basic one for now. But for someone testing out, I believe the free tier should be all right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. I think the other thing that must have happened, yes, you're right. Aside from having a limit on the amount of free accounts, it's also that I believe the free tier is offered within specific regions only. Is this
Yes.
just a region issue? Because I'm getting the
No,
same
so
error
it
for the
is,
basic tier
yeah.
as
So
well.
what region are you choosing? An India region?
I think it's automatically setting Central US for me.
Oh, okay.
So in that case, let me go ahead and do one thing. I'll go over to the
Portal.
beloved web portal because I just like using that anyway. So I'll just go ahead and create a resource from there. But yeah, no, this is something I'll probably look into it because it's probably just something to do with my
Just
specific.
just zoom in. Just zoom in.
Yeah, I'll just do that.
Uh-huh.
So the moment I start searching web app, I've got the app services tab here. Let me go and just click on create once. So I've got my subscription, the resource group I created, we've got it here. Let's go ahead and add a little name. Musachai. Yeah, that's good. We're going to be using code here. So I will leave it at code. As Tulika mentioned earlier, you can use a container as well. We've also got the static web app option within here now. I believe it's been for a while. And so if you are working on an SPA, a single page application, for example, that's an option you can explore as well. The runtime stack, of course, I will be selecting is .NET 7. Quick point, especially since recent updates within .NET, actually, this has been a few years now, but because now the default deployment server that .NET brings is Kestrel, and it's not necessarily just dependent on IaaS. Kestrel is cross-platform, so you can deploy it on Linux as well. I will still stick to Windows for now, but you can select Linux as well if you'd like. Additionally, Central India set, one thing here is that if you don't have an app service plan for this specific region available within your resource group, it creates one by default. For the pricing, we've got a few different tiers. I'll leave it at the standard for now, or maybe I'll just go to the shared D1. But there is actually quite a range of options with the estimated pricing, at least mentioned here, that you can look at, and each of these instances, of course, have um, different offerings, like the number of eCPUs or the amount of memory on the underlying application is mentioned. So you can check that, and based on your estimated usage, you can select an option that works best for you. Actually, let's go with the basic tier as I was earlier. Next thing, of course, is to set up deployment. For now, I will be directly deploying this from my VS Code instance, so I will disable GitHub Actions. But yes, you can actually automatically set up CI/CD with your GitHub account for app service, which is very convenient. And even if you don't do this at the stage of creating your web app on Azure, you can do this later on as well. Next up, we will select networking. I will enable public access because unless I do this, no one else can actually view the website. But if in case you have APIs that you want to run specifically for only to be accessed by internal resources or so on, this is actually a very handy tool where you can set it up behind uh, a private network as well. Next up, monitoring. I do like to keep application insights on, and this is an application performance management tool. Very, very handy, by the way. It lets you keep an eye across how your application is performing, if there are any specific errors it's facing, and so on. So quite versatile and a very, very handy tool as well. Next up, tags. These help you categorize better. For now, I will be skipping this, but if you have a large set of resources that are present for a particular purpose, it's great for categorizing. So considering we've got these options selected, I have my pricing, all the details, I'm going to go ahead and create this resource. I was just looking at the chat. The theme I have is actually the .NET theme for Visual Studio Code. This was released at one of the .NET Confs a couple of years back, and I believe you can just access it if you visit the .NET Conf website. So I do like the theme a lot, and I've been using it on my VS Code for a while since. So I've got my deployment running here. This basically means my resources are being set up. You don't have to sit on this page. You can leave it if you want. For now, I'll just wait and hang around.
Actually, when we are doing this deployment, what it's doing underlying is that it's creating a VM for you. It is setting up a subdomain for you, the name that he gave, samosachai.azurewebsites.net. So it's doing that registration, creating the VM for you, and creating a content path for you so that whenever Aditya deploys his code, it'll go to that content path.
Cool. While this is happening, which type of samosas you like, Tulika? I mean, you like samosas. I'm assuming.
I just need the aloo samosa only. I mean,
have you tried kaju samosas, by the way?
No, aloo.
No, have you tried kaju samosas?
No, I haven't.
You should.
So people who have joined us from different countries. So
actually, whenever Vivek does the samosachai.net, I ask him, is it an in-person event? And he always says no.
By the way, our resource is set up. We've got the domain here. So I believe this will have a default page. That's what it typically does.
A landing page.
But we've got our instance available here at least. And you can see the properties of this instance, the default domain. You can add custom domains as well, by the way, if someone has a domain they'd like to connect. There is some monitoring available, which is actually quite handy. Of course, there's some you can set up logging. There are, we've got capabilities that this particular application has, all very convenient. And you can see what's configured, what isn't as well. So this is quite a handy page, I will say. Now, because we have this set up, I'm just going to run a quick reload, and you can see that we've got our app service available here, right? And there's a lot you can do just out of VS Code here through the extension as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and deploy this web application. So because I reloaded, it sees that I have a resource available for this web app. So I will go ahead and select it, and I will deploy it from my local device. Actually, that should be all right.
Yep.
So nicely,
You can
it should
always
be
you
okay.
can always change.
Yeah, you can change that. Yes, that should be available in the config if I'm not wrong. But for now, it's all right.
So while it is deploying, Aditya, there is questions for you. Like, where can I
Oh,
get
well,
kaju
when I get Kaju
samosas?
Samosa, Yamuna Nagar has a very good place famous for these masala Kaju samosas.
Noida?
That's Yamuna
It's
Nagar.
in Noida. Oh, Yamuna Nagar. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
there's actually
where?
a
Yeah.
mithai wala there that I'm forgetting the name, but they have wonderful Kaju samosas.
Pranav
This
just
was
did
fast.
pro level. Pranav did pro level. Like he went out and he got samosas and he even eat it.
By the way, the website's already up and running. It's deployed. It's
Cool.
available. Yeah. So on default, that would have been the page that we would have seen when you don't have a web app deployed there. But now that we do, you can of course see that the same website we created locally is also available here. So there we have it. Sweet and simple.
So it's pretty interesting. If audience noticed that we just created a web app, and there is an option called deployments. And if you set up your code on a GitHub repo and connect that GitHub repo to your deployment,
Should I do that?
uh,
I can do that. Let's do that.
and if you want to try it live and then fail, go ahead, do it.
This one I won't fail with. I think I've done it so many times by now. And I'll deploy to a public repo as well. So if someone wants to check those GitHub action
Yeah.
runs, they can do that. Um,
Yep.
One thing I'll do is I'll
So
remove
that's the interesting
some of
part
my.
where you have your code and you have VS Code, you have code on GitHub, you have app service running, connect your GitHub to that. And the other important thing, I don't know if people noticed it, there is something called as deployment slots. So Tulika, you want to talk
Yeah.
about deployment slots? It's on the portal. We can really see that. Uh, Aditya, if you want to show the
Yeah.
portal, and
Oh, yeah.
there is deployment slots. So it's an interesting thing about deployment slots with app service.
Yeah, so unfortunately you don't get it for the free or the basic tier. You get it for standard or the premium plans. What deployment slots is, we heard a lot of feedback from customers that before they actually make their production, their website live, they would like to test it. And testing now with agile is this constant thing which always goes on, right? So you're constantly making changes,
Yeah.
you're constantly deploying code, you're constantly testing, but maybe you don't want all these changes going to your customers because you're still in the process of verifying. So we have this concept called deployment slots, where for the main web app itself we create almost like a clone of the app. So basically, you have your main production site, and then you can specify a staging slot, a test slot, another slot. So three slots. And we create the clone of the main site into these other slots. And now, when you deploy the code, we actually deploy to a slot instead of your main site. So now, and we give you a separate subdomain for it, so you can go ahead and test your slot, make sure that the code is right. But I think the coolest feature it provides is the ability to swap when you're ready. So you can go on deploying your code, you can go on testing your site, and when you're ready that everything is now working as I want it to work, I just go and say, now make my deployment slot or my staging slot into my production slot. And all we do is swap the domain name. So now all your traffic will automatically start going to where your staging slot, which has now become your production slot. So I think that's a really cool feature. And another small thing that we provide is something which we call tip or test in production, which is basically you might want to have actual customers browsing your staging slot just to get some traffic, just to see how it's performing. So you can specify rules and say, okay, 90% of my traffic, make it go to the production slot, but 10% of my traffic redirect to the staging slot. so that you can get some real-time feedback from customers about how your site is performing and if the features are working for them. So that I think
That
is
helps with
quite
A/B
handy.
testing probably on a few fronts.
Correct. It is A/B
Yeah,
testing.
Correct.
nice. In the meantime, of course, now that my application is available on GitHub, um, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the deployment center here and connect this web app with the GitHub repository. For that, I'm going to select my code source, and Azure does give a few options there. So if you're using Bitbucket, which is one of Atlassian's offerings for code hosting, or if you're using Azure repos, which by the way, I'm actually very fond of. I've had the opportunity to use Azure DevOps in one of my internships in the past, and Azure repos and Azure pipelines. Um, they've got a good setup there as well. So Azure repos is another option you can have here. For now, of course, I'm using GitHub. By the way, that's actually if you're self-hosting your own Git environment, you could just or you can actually set it up accordingly as well. But so in the meantime, I'm going to be using GitHub, and what this is going to do is once I select the repository I have, it will. There's a range. It's yet to load all my repositories. Wait, what? I don't think it's found all my repositories there yet.
How
It
many do
does
you
happen.
have?
I think 100. Yeah,
Ah.
there we are. And then, of course, you can select which particular branch you want to deploy, which is something you can do, by the way. If you want, a lot of people, what they do is they keep specific branches for deployments where they just merge changes after the PRs and so on. A lot of people use the main branch, some people use a different one, but you can select which branch you want to deploy. Once that is done, you can actually view the preview file, and this will show you what workflow is being created. And once that is done, you go ahead, you click on save, and this will actually set up your deployment pipeline. So what this will do is it will go to your, it'll create this GitHub workflow for you. It'll set up a GitHub action here that you can find. And after this, every single time you have a push on this particular branch on your repository, you will see this workflow run there, which, this is going to build your application and deploy it on this Azure App Service instance we have. The cool thing is that you can actually see exactly what's going to be happening here as well. So it's a really cool tool. Let's reload this. Right now, this is still running, but the convenient thing is, so anytime you enter your repository, if you see it as yellow, it means there is an action running. If it's red, what that basically means is that it failed. Your action failed, and if it's green, it means your action was successfully run. So you can directly access each specific run from here as well. And as you can see right now, it's setting up .NET Core on this web app for me. It'll then build the application, run .NET Publish, which creates that. If you saw that message earlier, right, which asked whether I wanted to set publish as my repository every single time, it sets up an exe, a DLL, and so on. So once this entire build occurs, there is another little task within the GitHub action, which is a deploy task. And as soon as all of that is done, we will see, of course, all the changes, the application up here within our app service instance. One cool thing is that you actually get these logs available in here as well. So you can actually reach your logs directly through your Azure portal as well. So it's quite handy that way.
Interesting build happened, and now it's deployment. Huh?
Now there's going to be the deploy step.
Yep. This is so easy, like Imagine running all these things on VM and trying to deploy on
Oh,
VMs. And wow, I've done that.
I don't
So,
even want to.
uh,
Yeah.
life has become so easy now.
It really has. It really has. And so the
So
really
why?
interesting thing is, you can actually access the underlying like system as well, running behind the app service. It actually gives you the FTP endpoint here. So very very cool, I will say.
So while this is running, there is one question in the chat. So basically, it's about multi-cloud platform. So if you have multi-cloud platform as a strategy, does it impact performance and scalability and other things? Um, so Tulke, I want to answer this question. I'll also add on top of that.
So I can take a stab at it. So if you have a multi-cloud, inherently that does not affect anything, because when you're choosing different cloud options, you're probably choosing and making the best choice for your um, needs. And scalability or performance is handled by every cloud, and most cloud providers will do their best to give you a 99.99% availability. They'll give you the best reasonable performance. So the fact that you're running multi-cloud, I do not think is going to make any difference whatsoever. What we have seen in the past for multi-cloud sometimes, which makes a difference, is just the network traffic which is going between the clouds. Because we often don't think about the network so much because we are not actively monitoring it, but there is a significant back and forth as you send traffic between the network. So what can happen and what we recommend customers who are using multi-cloud to use something like the direct fiber optic lines that we provide, or other cloud providers also provide, just to make sure that you are connected on a very fast network between the two clouds. So that's the only thing I would say which might cause any kind of delays between multi-clouds. But otherwise, inherently, your app should perform exactly the same.
So
Yep.
just an update
So,
there. We had the deploy run actually. Um, so what I'm gonna do
yeah, I
is,
saw that now.
actually I think we can cancel this run for now. I'm just gonna cancel it for now, and I will instead make a new commit to trigger the workflow once again, because um, what I'm going to show here is an example of how this CI/CD solution will work. So in the meantime, what I did is I made a little change to this website here, where of course that's the deployed website we have, but on my local system I added another little message to check out the samosachai.net website, right? Which is quite a nifty website, by the way. I am very fond of it. It's nice.
Oh, you are
Um,
in. We have a dark mode as well.
oh, nice. So what I'm
That's
gonna do
something
is,
niche thing.
ah, very nice. So I'm gonna go ahead and do one thing. Um, I will make a commit to the main branch now, and I will just add a commit message, add link to samosachai.net. I will commit this and sync changes, of course. I should have pulled earlier. That would have just brought the workflow back, but that's okay. So now when I go to this repository, right, um, does the
You
push
have
happen?
GitHub Actions running. I think it did. Oh,
Okay, I must have like, yeah,
check
now
your
it
GitHub
has.
Actions. Yeah.
Yeah, it's up. So we've got the run happening. That was the last message because it had to merge the pull as well, and then it pushed it up, of course. So as soon as I pushed it up, we had the GitHub action get triggered again. And we will be able to see this reflected here, where we've got the build uh, running for me. And that last commit message you saw, right, the merge branch, that is the message it puts up here as well. So that's actually quite handy, right? Because you want to know what, it helps you keep in mind at which point this deployment has been made in your code as well. And so now at least one good thing here is that because it's, we've set up CI/CD with GitHub, all I need to do to get the deployment to happen is just push to GitHub. Every single time I push to the main branch on my GitHub repository, it will automatically deploy this application to Azure App Service, and so I don't need to keep manually deploying it every single time, which does save a lot of work.
True.
So right now we've got the run in progress. It's going to take a little bit of its own time, of course. That does happen, but it'll let us know once the deployment occurs.
Yep.
Right now it's in progress, but it'll happen.
I mean, but that's the process, right? So you just
Yeah,
make changes to the code, and the GitHub Actions is running now. And once it is completed, the code goes into the app service, and you're not
exactly,
you're not doing much now, right? So you're just going to code. You're going to make
exactly.
changes to your business logic, and it's just going to the production or deployment slots which you have
Yeah.
selected, and make use of Azure App Service there. So yeah, we are end of the show. By the way, we've gone beyond the time limit. That is, I mean, we have never closed samosa.net within the time period. Uh,
That's there.
it's
I think probably the
there.
one last thing we can just keep an eye out for is that because this deployment's almost there, the build is done, so we can just see that final change coming up. I think that should be another minute or so, but we're almost there. So I think we're getting some questions in the chat. Vivek.
Yeah, I've been sharing couple of learn modules and other things which you need to understand. There is a question on uh, how to containerize, and can I containerize a web app? So I'm just sharing couple of inputs there. Um,
Mhm.
Regarding VPC workflow in Azure and other things, we don't call it VPC, by the way. So, anyways, we you can take a look at the learn modules. I'll just share a couple of learn modules, and you can understand those network, how it works, virtual network works in Azure. Um, yeah, I think pretty much we have covered all the questions which came in. Um, while it is getting deployed, we can wait for a minute. uh, I'm also craving for samosas now because it's like 2 hours, and definitely I
I
need a
just
samosa.
want to mention that there is no automatic way to containerize your app. So, it
Yeah.
like you for creating a container. So that was one of the questions. Can we containerize a web API app? And there's no automatic way to do that. Because a container, I mean, though we say it's so simple, it's not exactly that simple. It's basically you have to do things like you have to specify what is the app server which is going to run in it, which is the port you're going to listen to. There are so many settings that you would have to specify to make sure it is a container app. So therefore, there is no tool on a way that you just click and you can have a container app. Unfortunately, you will have to go through the documentation Vivek sent and do all the required steps and
Learn how to build containers.
how
That's
to
it.
build a container.
So
It would involve creating a Docker file, of course, but before you can create the Docker file, you have to make sure that you have certain things within your folder. And
if you want to learn some stuff, so I'll also share one interesting link, which is
Great.
Draft. Uh, it's Draft for Kubernetes. It's an open source tool, so you can create all those YAMLs, and it does create a Docker file, but it's you'll have to go back and edit it. It's not like automatically creating the
yeah,
complete Docker file for you. you need to edit, and even the YAML file it creates, you need to make sure you'd go and verify and edit it, but it just simplifies that process. Yep, just
By
take a
the
look
way,
at that.
the website
Mhm.
deployed, the deployment's complete. I actually quite like how this just sends over the URL.
Link to you.
Um, yeah, within the action as well. But the application has deployed, and now that we've got this, like I just checked the link we have, the deployed link, and we've got this update we made locally that we just pushed to GitHub. So the action is a success. It's running. Yay!
Aditya
Um,
Aditya is
You
happy.
sound surprised. You sound
I'm
surprised.
not surprised. My surprise, I think, isn't at the deployment. It's just I noticed that the actions took a little bit of time, but then I realized that it was just taking time to assign GitHub Actions runners. So that's the part I'm happy about, because I know GitHub's been getting so much usage lately with Actions especially, but I'm glad that's true.
Good. So cool. And we come to the end of our show. And thank you, Aditya and Tulika, coming here and sharing your insights with us. And I'm sure audience took a lot out of this discussion we had. I also learned a lot of things as well. So thank you for coming here. Thank you, Rashmita, for hosting. Uh, by the way, this is the last episode of season 4. We're going to come back with season 5 of samosachai.net. So just hold on to it. We're going to be back. As you see, we are missing our host, Nish. We're going to have new host as well. So it's going to be fun. Cool. Until then, enjoy our reactor sessions. Keep coming back. Thank you all. Thank you for being here.